Good morning, everybody. I hope you're having a wonderful time in Guildford and in London. I'm sitting here at Rui's kitchen table in Raleigh, North Carolina. Today I'm going to talk about pubs, and I'm going to be drawing partly on some of the images from Dickens' illustrations to make some points about the social history of pubs. There are a few main points I want to cover. First of all, the three different kinds of pubs that existed, which really came together to form the pub as we know it today. I'll look at some of the historical functions of pubs. Then we'll look at the pub in the Victorian period, and many of the pubs that you will see in London and indeed Guildford were built around the 19th century. Then I'll look at the conflict between the commercial brewing and the real ale drinkers, and finally perhaps a few words to say about your going to a pub in Guildford and the kinds of things that you might look out for as a result of having heard what I've talked about today. I think we chose pubs because pubs seem to be a quintessentially English institution, and this is what the 20th century poet Hilaire Belloc wrote. When you have lost your inns, drown your empty selves, for you will have lost the last of England. The English pub is often the focal point of the community, especially in small towns or villages where people gather not just to drink, but to gossip and exchange news and views. Now, my parents kept the only shop in a small village in North Wales, and right next door was the Wheatsheaf pub, and right across the road was the church. And together these three institutions, shop, pub and church, provided the community with bodily and, let us hope, spiritual sustenance. But the village pub is just one kind among many, and the pubs in Guildford are all distinctive in one way or another. So I want to look at the history briefly of the pub, and I think we can distinguish between three different kinds: alehouse, tavern and inn. Now the alehouse, and you might look at this slide from Sketches by Boz, if you remember that, a collection of sketches that Dickens brought together in 1836-37, and he'd been writing these for newspapers at the time. And when they became collected together, he had George Cruikshank illustrate some of these. And this is a thing called Scotland Yard, which is now the kind of FBI centre in London, but was then a suburb of London, and this is one of the alehouses in the area. And Dickens writes about this, and it's set really in the 1820s, and it seems to me to illustrate what we mean by the alehouse, which dates back to Anglo-Saxon times. It was simply, as you can see here, a domestic dwelling, and the wife brewed ale and sold it to passing foot travellers directly from her kitchen. So if your name is Brewster, this is the female equivalent of the male brewer. We have brewer as in Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, and Brewster is the female equivalent. And you can see from this that people would simply just walk into this front room. There's no sort of bar as such, sit down at a table before the open fire, and the ale wife would bring in the pot of ale. And these are coal heavers, and you can see that their headgear is to protect them from the coal and the coal dust. So this would have been close to the River Thames, where the barges from the north of England brought coal down, and then they were offloaded for distribution to London houses. Now, the brewing wife would mix up her ale in a big cask with a long stick, and when it was ready to be drunk, she would stick the stick outside the house to indicate that the brew was ready. And this is the origin of the signs of pub signs that we see today outside of pubs. Now, there's a whole history of pub signs that you could go into, which I won't do, but look for the different kinds of pub signs in the streets in and around Guildford, for example. They will indicate the kind of people who might have inhabited the pub and used it as their local. Now, the second kind of pub is the tavern, which you would find usually in a town or a city, where people met to conduct business. And taverns go back a long way. They go back to Chaucer, who mentions the tabard, and Shakespeare. The Mermaid Tavern is where Falstaff used to drink a lot. Now, taverns were larger than alehouses, and they served wine as well as ale and beer, and often had separate dining rooms or boxes and cubicles for eating, so you could actually dine there. But by law, they could not shelter guests, and they had limited hours. So if you needed to stay overnight, you didn't go to a tavern, but you went to an inn, which is the third kind of pub I'm talking about here. Now, the inn was often a large country house. That is 2:30 Raleigh time. The inn was often a large country house, strategically located at crossroads to provide travellers with board and lodging, and the place where coaches stopped to rest or change horses while travellers refreshed themselves. So a couple of examples from literature. In Great Expectations, Pip waits for the beautiful Estella to arrive from the country at a London inn. In Bleak House, Esther Summerson is met by the London law clerk, Mr. Guppy, also at a coaching inn. So in cities, inns were often the termini for coaches. Now, there's only one surviving galleried coaching inn in London, and it's called the George at Southwark. And you can get there by taking the train or tube to London Bridge Station. Okay, it's only one stop from Waterloo, where you arrive from Guildford. So if you're interested in that, it's now a National Trust property, and they have preserved it as a galleried coaching inn. And you enter, and there's a huge courtyard, and travellers could stay overnight in the upstairs rooms and overlook the activities in the courtyard below. It was, by the way, a haunt of Dickens. Unlike alehouses, which provided for the weary foot traveller, who sometimes slept on the kitchen floor, and possibly you can see in this coal heavers in an alehouse that maybe they could actually just lie down in front of the fire and go to sleep. Inns, on the other hand, were upmarket places for those who could afford to stay a night and pay for a coach ride. In Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Lady Catherine de Bourgh tells Elizabeth Bennet to mention her name at the Bull Inn when she travels back home. And Lizzie and her wealthy aunt and uncle Gardiner stay at an inn when they are on holiday. And in Jane Austen's novels, inns were also where local assemblies took place, concerts and balls. They also functioned as places for local magistrates to hold sessions, and where inquests, coroners' inquests took place. For example, there's one in Bleak House that's held at a tavern or an inn, and where also you could hire local labour. So, over the centuries then, these three original distinctions between the humble alehouse, the urban and often rumbustious tavern, and the traveller's inn gradually collapsed, and the modern pub owes something to all three. But I think it's certainly worth remembering their importance to the social life of Britain. So let me sum up then a few of the functions that have emerged regarding pubs. Their location meant inns were transportation centres. They were also employment centres, primarily for casual labour during, for example, harvest time. Hence, a pub might be called the Wheat Sheaf or the Miller's Arms or something like that. They provided facilities of large rooms and so they could host large gatherings, including legal assemblies. Now, the flip side of that was that in slum areas, London pubs, or some of them, became centres for criminal activities. And as an example of one of these pubs in Oliver Twist, where Fagin is in the Three Cripples pub, and there he is meeting Noah Claypole, and eventually he's actually going to persuade him to act as a spy for him, looking at Nancy, who he thinks has betrayed the gang of thieves. So Fagin is a fence where he has his children steal handkerchiefs and watches from gentlemen on the streets of London. He would take them to an inn like the Three Cripples and on-sell them. Now, pubs were also venues for political gatherings, places where working class politics took root, and thus hotbeds of potential insurrection. So the law and pubs have always had a close association, not just because of drunkenness and disorderliness. You can in fact be charged under English law with being what is called drunk and disorderly, so I warn you against that, which I assume stems from certain types that pubs attracted. Now, pubs also hosted trade union meetings and became informal clubs where working men could get together. They put on dances and various other entertainments of varying degrees of respectability, ranging at one end from the rather sedate balls of Jane Austen's novels to somewhat risque performances characteristic of the Victorian Music Hall. Now, the Victorian Music Hall has its origins in the pub, and there ladies of the night paraded to pick up customers. Now, if the pub, some pubs have games associated with them, very traditional English games, and if it has a garden, you might find a game called Skittles being played in the back garden, which is a kind of lawn version of 10-pin bowling. Also, tossing the horseshoe was another game, obviously based on the fact that some inns were close to blacksmiths where horses' shoes could be quickly repaired after before the coach journey could be continued. But the quintessential English pub game is darts. And dart boards may be seen in many of the pubs in London today, and so look out for those. They're often to one side of the room because of the danger of darts when they're being thrown. And you can actually play a game. You can ask the landlord, who often keeps a set of darts behind the bar, and you simply ask to borrow it. Last but not least, pubs offered relaxation and refreshment after a day's work, and many pubs retain their association with a particular trade or profession. Just to give a few examples: the Miller's Arms, the Village Blacksmith, the Wheat Sheaf, the Bricklayer's Arms, the Fisherman's Rest, the Jolly Sailor, the Three Porters, and so on. And I've quoted this in my last presentation. Joe Gardery, in Great Expectations, says, "A pint of beer do give refreshment to the working man," and to you, no doubt, in a few hours' time. Here's a little ditty that I've culled from somewhere. Beer, happy produce of our isle, can sinewy strength impart, and wearied with fatigue and toil, can cheer each manly heart, or womanly heart, as the case may be. Let's go on to the Victorian period then. Many of the pubs date from that time. Victoria came to the throne in 1837 and died in 1901, so she is in fact the longest living monarch, and I think the current Queen Elizabeth is determined to beat that 63 or 4 years reign. And many legal and social changes that took place in the 19th century had an important effect on pubs and indeed their architecture. Now, in the 18th century, gin drinking was a major social problem, and I'm wearing this T-shirt which shows William Hogarth's famous Gin Lane, which shows what happens if you drink too much gin. And there's a companion piece called Beer Street, which shows people in a very wealthy and comfortable situation with fat beer drinkers and so on. Okay, now as a result of this problem with gin drinking, in 1830 the Beer House Act was passed. Now this is rather a misconceived idea that if beer was made cheaper and more readily available, then the working classes would be weaned off gin, which is the name for which comes from the Dutch juniper berry. And of course the beer lobby saw that it would give a boost to the English beer industry. And that was a powerful force in English politics. Now, I've told you about the topicality of Dickens and how he incorporates topics of the day into his novels. Here is Oliver Twist outside a beer shop, entitled Oliver Claimed by His Affectionate Friends. Oliver has been rescued from the boy Fagin's gang by the kindly Mr. Brownlow, who dresses him up to be a little gentleman, as you can see in this illustration, and he has been asked to take some books back to the bookseller and get some new ones. And he is spotted in the street by Bill Sikes and Nancy. And interestingly, Cruikshank has illustrated this capture outside one of these new beer shops. As you can see from the sign, it says licensed to sell, note the misspelling, S-E-L, beer by retail, and you can see how much it cost in the window, threepence or 3 pennies. Someone asked me about the D before, and there it is in that sign, and you can see that the man selling the beer is simply opened up his house, and all you had to do was to pay 2 guineas to the authorities, and you could simply open up your house and sell beer. Well, the unfortunate result, of course, was that there was just as much drunkenness as there was before this act. The government increased taxes on imported gin to discourage the imbibing of that liquid. Now, I think another point worth remarking on here is that beer was safe to drink. Fresh water was virtually unobtainable in the early Victorian period, and a major outbreak of cholera in 1848 was traced to one street pump in central London, and today, opposite the site of that pump in Broadwick Street, Soho, you can visit this, is a pub called John Snow, which is named after the physician who discovered that cholera is a waterborne disease and who identified that particular pump as the source of the epidemic. Not that beer was unadulterated. Unscrupulous landlords would add water to beer or minerals to give beer an attractive look, and this practice was not made illegal until 1885. It's pretty hot in Raleigh here. How hot is it over there in Guildford? Now, how did the 1830 Beer Act affect the pub in the 19th century? Now, in order to recover the drinkers' patronage lost to the 31,000 beer houses that sprung up in the 1830s as a result of this act, gin dives were made more attractive, hence the rise of the so-called gin palaces with their large sheet glass windows, and that was a recent technological development, spacious rooms with mirrors, gas lighting, another new technology, and one not seen in homes actually until the 1850s, and warmth. Here is Dickens writing in 1836, and here's another illustration from a sketch he did for a newspaper, and it was called The Gin Shop, again illustrated by George Cruikshank. I quote from Sketches by Boz. The Gin Palace had deposited splendid mansions, stone balustrades, rosewood fittings, immense lamps, and illuminated clocks at the corner of every street. Now all of those features are not illustrated here, but you can see those pillars are kind of almost Grecian in style, and the cornice around the top of the ceiling, and these huge barrels of gin that were being supplied to the customers, who are of various types. Now, in turn, these gin palaces turned to selling any alcoholic drink, beer included, while existing pubs followed the gin palace in upgrading premises to attract more customers. As London grew outwards and suburbs were built to accommodate the ever-increasing population, new pubs were strategically placed on street corners and on major highways to capture the commuter market. Again, this is another sketch by Dickens called Seven Dials. This is a junction of 7 streets in London, and here you can see a fight or an argument going on between 2 women, but outside one of these gin shops. And you might note the man in the right bottom corner. He is the pot boy who is carrying pots of beer from this pub or gin shop to various customers throughout the city. Workers would stop off on their way home for what's called a quick one at the local, a custom that's alive and well in today's London. My daughter Emily lives in the city of London, and when I meet her, we always go to her local pub. Now, Victorian England was a class-ridden society, and 21st century England, I think, still is. Now, the architecture of pubs reflected and confirmed class divisions. Large pubs had different rooms or bars for different kinds of customers from different classes. And this is what Dickens in Sketches by Boz writes. A handsome plate of ground glass in one door directs you to the counting house, another to the bottle department, a third to the wholesale department, a fourth to the wine promenade, and so forth. So these different entrances to different rooms in pubs may still be seen in today's pubs. Let's give some examples of the different kinds of rooms that are available, so watch out for them when you go into a pub in Guildford or in London. There was the public bar, which, as the name suggests, was for the general public, essentially at that time for the working and lower middle classes. Then there was the saloon bar, from the French salon, implying a larger, more luxurious room for social functions. And we might note here that until quite recently in England there was a small shop, often placed between the public and the saloon bars, all 3 having a separate entrance from the street. And this little shop was called an off-licence, the equivalent of today's bottle store or bottle shop, where you could purchase alcohol to take home and drink. I mean, it was off-licence because you could buy the alcohol there but not drink it on the premises. You had to take it away. Now, the first of these off-licences appeared in 1834 in response to, interestingly, the advent of bottled beer. That's another invention which shaped the way that pubs were constructed. Now, this bottled beer and the off-licence was favoured by the respectable middle classes because increasingly during the Victorian period pubs became less respectable, partly as a result of the temperance movement. They were not places to be seen at, and so one took one's drink home, out of sight, out of mind. In 1852, this is what one observer noted, that, quote, no person above the rank of labouring man or artisan would venture to go into a public house. Now this lasted while the temperance movement in England, which began, by the way, in the 1830s, held sway. But by the end of the century, it had faded, and England actually resisted the pressure from the prohibitionists in America to follow suit in the early 20th century. And I think this resistance is mainly because of a long history of sociable drinking in England. Beer, it was argued, was supposedly good for you. Now, one of the most famous advertisements for Guinness is "Guinness is good for you." Beer was the English national drink, the pub a national institution, and no damn Yankee was going to tell John Bull to forsake his beloved pint. Incidentally, I think it's worth distinguishing between the temperance reformers who campaigned against the drinking of spirits and excessive drinking of non-spirits, hence the word temperance, and teetotalism, which advocated complete abstention from all alcoholic drinks. Now, there's a handout I think that you should have called the Temperance Thermometer. This comes from the London Journal of 1845, and it's produced by the Temperance Society, and you can see that above zero certain drinks are perfectly okay. At the top, at the 70 degrees, is water, which gives you health and reputation, followed by milk, which gives you tranquility and happiness, small beer, which means weak beer, which gives you long life and wealth, porter, which gives you strength and enjoyment, ale, nourishment and ease, cider, cheerfulness and intellect, and wine, hilarity and comfort. So those are all okay for the temperance advocates. But below zero, what you find is spirits. So 10 below, a flip, which is a kind of mixture, I think, of gin and egg. Incidentally, that was drunk by Gladstone during his long speeches to the English Parliament in the 1870s and 1880s. This gives you heat and debt. Then there were bitters, which gives you sickness and rags, cold grog, which gives you dropsy and hunger, and hot grog, which gives you inflammation and leads to the workhouse. Now, grog was a mixture of rum and water and spices, and comes from the 18th century. It was given to the English sailors of the 18th century and is named after Admiral Vernon, who wore a large coarse cloak called a grogham cloak. And so the word grog derives from that, because he suggested that the sailors needed their rum. Now, further down the scale, you could drink gin, which would lead to madness and the prison. Then you could drink rum, which would lead to palsy and transportation. And finally, the worst of all, brandy at 70 below, which led to death and the gallows. Just a little anecdote. My father initially used to work for a wines and spirits company, and when he met my mother and she took him home to her parents, my father was a Methodist minister and his wife, my grandmother, was a temperance advocate, so this was going to cause some problems. I remember in her effects she left a little badge with 5 stars, which indicated that she had collected a certain number of people to sign the pledge not to drink, and as a result of that you got this little badge. So there was my grandmother meeting this prospective son-in-law who was in the drink trade, and my grandfather, who was a very moderate man, he wasn't a fire and brimstone Methodist minister, far from it, according to my mother, said to his wife, "Kate, it's the man that counts, not the job." And apparently that was the end of that. Now, I mentioned that the advent of bottled beer is one small example of how technology affects the way people live, the social landscape, if you like. And I hardly need to tell you how digital technologies have changed our social landscape. I used to give students in my course on the 19th century novel the example of the invention of the railway and how that changed the landscape of England during the 19th century, both physical landscape and social landscape. For example, how it affected the publishing industry, allowing the efficient distribution of books. Now, you remember that Dickens produced his books in monthly parts. And not only were they sold in London, but they were sold in all the big major cities in Manchester and Birmingham and so on, and they had to be got there as quickly as possible, and the railway effected this. Inventions in the drink industry also profoundly affected the social landscape. Bottled beer was one, and another was the development of cheap clear glass after the removal of duty on glass in 1847. So beer was made to actually look attractive in clear glasses, which replaced the old pewter beer pot. Now, the old pewter pot actually had a glass bottom to it, and the idea was that in Elizabethan England, when you were drinking in say, Falstaff's Tavern, you would drink your beer like this, and you could see through the bottom if anyone was about to attack you in a tavern. So that was the reason why pewter pots had glass bottoms. As a result of this clear glass being having its duty removed in 1847, beer could be paler in colour and therefore look more attractive. So the emergence of pale ale is in contrast to the dark beer like porter and dates from this time. So India Pale Ale, IPA, you'll be familiar with that I think, was so named because it was sent to India to quench the thirst of British colonials. Today we hold up a poured glass of beer. Here I've got simply a glass of water, but it's pretty clear, to admire the colour of the beer, and this practice dates from the mid-19th century. So when you order your beer, why not just hold it up to the light and see the colour of it? Now, another invention at the time was the hydraulic pub. It enabled beer to be pumped from the casks in the cellar directly to the bar, where it could be served to customers standing at the bar. At the same time, the long counter-style bar with several pump handles developed in the new so-called gin palaces of the early 19th century, and you will see in most pubs today that you go into a range of pump handles, and you can choose from those which particular brew takes your fancy. Now, the invention of the hydraulic pump saw the demise of the pot boy. Again, if you look at the Seven Dials sketch, you can see the pot boy, the bottom right, carrying pots of beer to his customers in another part of the street. So once the hydraulic pump came, there was really, people would go to the pub and drink it there. So this is my last one. This is David Copperfield orders a drink. Now this was done not by Cruikshank but by Hablo K. Brown, Fizz. And although this was published in 1850, it is in fact set back in the 1820s. And here we have little David, who's been working at the equivalent of the blacking warehouse that Dickens was sent to, if you recall, when he was a small boy of 12, taking a day off and going to a local pub. And what interests me here is the little counter, the fact that this is, there's a man and a wife who looked very friendly and domestic, as though they've just come out of the back parlour. So this particular pub is warm and friendly and cosy. In the window there's a Bacchus sitting on a barrel to advertise that you can come in and have a drink. And at the feet of David are some pots. The pot boy is nowhere to be seen, but those will be the pots that the pot boy would fill up and take to customers elsewhere. So the pot boy, he, was then replaced by the barmaid, she. And obviously the barmaid was sometimes hired by the landlord for her good looks in order to attract his mainly male customers, and she would also serve at tables, so you might look out to see if there is an attractive barmaid in any of the pubs you go into. Now, I think also social relations changed, or social relationships changed, where before the old style pub, the customer was more like a guest in the publican's house. I think the David Copperfield sketch shows this. Now, as the brewing industry developed in the 19th century, the publican became a retailer whose primary aim was profit from his customer. So the pub and the brewing industry came a part of capitalist society, and this is seen in the growth of that industry into one of the great capitalist industries of the 19th century. In Great Expectations, for example, Miss Havisham is in fact the heiress of a great brewing family, although that's now in disuse. So we have the public bar, the saloon bar, obviously for the better off classes who might want to relax. And from that there emerged what was called the lounge bar, and that's still common today. And occasionally you might see a room called the parlour. And in all of those, the saloon, the lounge bar and the parlour, drinks will be brought to you rather than you go up to the bar to order them. And finally there was something called the marvellously named snuggery, especially reserved for ladies who wanted a drink but did not want to besmirch their reputation by being seen in a pub. So the snug, as it was abbreviated, was tucked away and had tinted windows so a passerby could not see who was imbibing the devil's potion. And the prices of drinks, depending on where you went, varied according to whether you're in the saloon bar, the public bar and so on. Okay, back then to the rise of the great commercial breweries in the 19th century. Home and local brewing was replaced by large companies like Guinness, Bass and Whitbread. And in 1870 there were some 26,000 breweries, but by 1914 only a tenth, some 2,600, were left. So the large breweries invested capital in buying privately owned pubs, upgrading their facilities and building new pubs. Such pubs owned by a single brewery are called tied houses. These terms are on your handout, by the way, since they are tied to that brewery and can sell only their products. Now those of us who like to see ourselves as sort of beer aficionados don't like tied houses because their architecture can be as similar as their beer. There is literally a house style, and you can drink, say, only Bass or Whitbread beers. Real ale drinkers much prefer free houses, which, as the name suggests, are free, rather than tied, to sell any kind of beer, whoever brews it. Now in the 1970s there was a danger of the free house disappearing altogether, but CAMRA, on your handout, the Campaign for Real Ale, was formed to protect the free house and lobby for something that was better than the mass-produced beer of the major breweries. It was so successful that the big breweries now brew beer according to traditional methods. So I'm quoting from CAMRA, and it's on your handout under CAMRA. Real ale is a natural product brewed using traditional ingredients and left to mature in the cask container from which it is served in the pub through a process called secondary fermentation. I'm nearly finished. One of the reasons for the growth of the major breweries was the growing railway network. The first passenger train in England ran between Manchester and Liverpool in 1827. The great decade of the expansion of the railway network was the 1840s. Breweries could consolidate their brewing in one centre because of this efficient distribution network. Burton-on-Trent, Trent being a river, whose water was particularly good for brewing, Burton-on-Trent is in the Midlands, became a centre for brewing beer. Now at the same time, railway stations at the major termini saw the development of pubs to refresh the traveller, choked by steam and smoke, or waiting for their train to depart. So we get the railway hotel superseding, in the early 19th century, the coaching inn. And it developed one more architectural feature characteristic of railway station bars, namely the island bar, a sort of squashed out circle rather like that, where you could accommodate a lot of customers at the same time. Railways were not the only method of transportation to affect the style of pubs. To go back to the previous century, in the 18th century, the latter part of that century, saw the great boom in canal building, and pubs were built on the rivers or on the canal banks to serve bargees and the navvies. The navvies was a nickname for the navigators, the labourers who actually dug the canals. And you may see these pubs along waterways throughout England. The canals will be straight, the rivers will be winding, and the different style of pubs are different according to whether it's a canal or a river. So the ones by the canal usually built with brick or stone, and the attractive older wooden type of pub will be found alongside the river. And I think the row barge in Guildford on the River Way is an example, but I'm not sure it's still open. So that's really all I have to say, except just a few final words about going to a pub, which we'll be doing in an hour or so. So you can bring all these things together, and as you go into the pub, you might want to look out for some of the things that I've mentioned here. What kind of bar you're going into? Are there several entrances? As you go in, what's the architecture like? Look at the architecture from the outside and you'll get an idea if it's an old coaching inn, perhaps with black and white facade, or more traditional bricklayers' arms, which would have served the brickies building houses at the time. So look at the outside, look at the inside to see if that's an indication of anything about the pub. And as you go in, look at the glass windows. Some of them are quite interesting with various features on them. Look at the arrangement of the seating, whether the floor is wooden or if it's still old style brick. Look at the bar in particular and the different types of pump handles which serve different kinds of ales or beer, mainly bitter. And I would suggest that you ask the landlord for a local brew. I like to experiment rather than one of the standard national brews. So ask for his recommendation, and you can buy it in a half-pint pot, a fairly small amount, just to try it, to see if you like it or not. If you get friendly with the landlord, I think it's happened a couple of years ago, so one group was taken down to the cellars, and the landlord was very proud to show how things operated down in the cellars, and how beer was kept at a certain temperature and how it found its way up to the bar and so on. So try and get on side with the landlord if he's there, but also be aware that there will be regulars or locals who might resent a large number of Americans coming into a pub. So be considerate and don't sort of take over the pub, but be respectful of people who see it as a kind of home from home, which it is for many of them. Well, that's all I have to say, except good drinking, and have a good time while you're in London. Bye for now.